classes and had to be consulted by government before a decision to change the legal status of a drug is made. And it worked very, very well. There are penalties under the Act, penalties for possession and penalties for supply. And an important civil liberty we have in this country is that unless you're a prisoner, having taken a drug is not illegal. So if you test positive for a drug, unless you're an airline pilot or maybe a train driver, that's not illegal. There are civil sanctions, but it's not illegal. There are no criminal sanctions for having taken a drug unless you're a prisoner. So but possessing a drug can give you significant time in jail. And there are people in jail for possessing Class A drugs like MDMA, ecstasy, for up to 6 years, 15 tablets. So there are potential anomalies in terms of the way in which drugs, the harms of drugs, are actually punished under this Act at present. Now, by and large, politicians did what they should do with the Act. They took advice. So this is the best example I know of, that in 1994, the ACMD went to Margaret Thatcher and said, if you want to stop an AIDS epidemic, we've got to have needle exchange. And she said, Tories don't do needle exchange. So they said, OK, well, you've got a choice. You know, Tories either do AIDS or needle exchange. Which is it? And she said, OK, we do needle exchange. You're the experts. If that's going to work. And so she turned. Maybe the only time in her life she turned. And remarkable. We brought in needle exchange, and we had one of the lowest rates of HIV from intravenous drug use in the world. So scientifically designed policy accepted by politicians. Worked. How does the Act work? Well, the Act is complicated. It's got the classes. I showed you the 3 classes. High risk, very high risk, moderate risk. The green bars are medicines, so doctors can prescribe them. The red ones have never been medicines, and the ones in the middle have been medicines and no longer medicines and may yet be medicines. So there's a complicated system of prescribed drugs and non-prescribed drugs. But the more important point is this, is that the Act was supposed to reflect the relative harms of drugs. So drugs in each class should be equally harmful. So drugs were able to move up and down in the classes according to evidence of harm. And over the years, we've seen a number of drugs come into the Act. So the black arrows are drugs which have come into the Act or moved their position in the Act. And these are all things that happened while I was on the ACMD. So the first thing you'll notice is that quite a lot of drugs became illegal when I was on the ACMD, which I think hopefully makes you realize that I'm not the kind of crazy legalizer that people like Melanie Phillips think I am, because I supported making all those drugs illegal. You'll also notice that the only drug that's gone down ever, the only arrow going in the right-hand direction, is cannabis. And that happened about 2004, and it created such hysteria in some of the press that we've spent the last 5 years fighting that hysteria, and eventually it was reclassified. And you see that's a blue arrow going in that direction. The blue arrows are decisions which were made against the advice of the ACMD. And the dotted blue arrow was MDMA, ecstasy. We recommended Class B last year, and that was rejected by the government. So only one drug has ever moved downwards, found its proper position. And there are clear anomalies. Drugs like MDMA, are under any kind of metric, are not as harmful as crack cocaine, and yet they're in Class A. Because once things get into a class, any attempt to move them is met with enormous amount of press criticism. So where did things start to go wrong? Well, I've reflected a lot on this. I've had plenty of time, I suppose, in a way, to reflect. And it goes back to the war in Iraq. And it goes back to our friendship with George, who was waging a war on drugs very ineffectually for all the time. But Mr. Blair, I think, got really sucked into the idea that you can win wars. And he decided in 2004 that having won the war in Iraq, he was going to win the war on drugs. And we get a huge amount of pressure from the US to do what they do with drugs, which is put people in prison forever as a deterrent. And he succumbed to that pressure to some extent by taking on the mushrooms. So the mushrooms used to be legal drugs. And then they made them Class A drugs in 2004. Why did that happen? Well, We don't know why it happened because we weren't consulted. We heard that he was planning to do it. And so we said, hang on, there is a thing called the Misuse of Drugs Act, which says you have to consult with the ACMD before you make a change in the law. And they said, oh. And then I think on Tuesday evening, we got an email saying, on Thursday, we're going to have a debate about the classification of the mushrooms. What do you think? And we said, well, that's just an insult. So you can't possibly do a harm assessment on a class of drugs in 2 days. So on your head be it. So they did. They decided class A. Why? Because the parent compound psilocybin was class A for no good reason other than it was put there 40 years ago. So that was the first problem. But the war got worse because then they decided to wage war on other drugs like cannabis. And war has some problems. I mean, there's collateral damage to many people. And some of the damage is to the truth. And if there was any educational value in the Misuse of Drugs Act, it virtually disappeared when mushrooms were made the same class as crack cocaine. It made it very difficult to talk to children about the harms of drugs in terms of the classification system. And of course, there's also this other adage, once at war, all reason is treason. And that's why I was sacked. I didn't know about that phrase at the time, but I've subsequently learned about it. Not that it would have changed much anyway if I hadn't known. And it is a war. There's American soldiers with their faces pixelated out, so you can't see that they're standing downwind of the cannabis and inhaling. So they're fighting the war in Afghanistan. That's burning cannabis. And why do we have the war? Well, I think one of the sad things about Blair was that he decided to fight the war on drugs without consulting the ACMD, without telling us. In fact, he had an inner cabinet of police, senior police, Ministry of Defense, serious organized crime, to fight the war. He decided that was what he was going to do. He didn't need the advice of the ACMD to tell him how to deal with the drug problem. So why do we have the war? Well, we have the war to reduce the harms of drugs. And I suppose if it did reduce the harms of drugs to society, well, maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing to fight. But of course, there's also the war on the user. And that's the problem. And the way it goes is government philosophy is we'll criminalize you, we might even imprison you to protect you and others from the possible harms of drugs. And this is exactly what the last government did, because they brought in, not only they moved cannabis back from C to B, so giving a possibility of 5 years imprisonment, but they also made cannabis possession an arrestable offence. So the police can and do regularly pick people up on the streets of London. I don't know if they do it here. And they take them to the police cells, they hold them for 24 hours, they can search their homes, and they can seize your assets if they prosecute you under the Proceedings of Crime Act. And they do that. And they do that to people who are using cannabis recreationally, and they do it to people who are using cannabis for medicinal purposes. And that is a real conundrum to me, because we know half of young people use cannabis. Very few experience health harm. There's virtually no harm to society. So the policy criminalizes people, and criminalizing someone changes their life trajectory completely. Absolutely. Once you've got a criminal record, it's very difficult to achieve your full potential. But that process will have very little impact on health, and it denies access to cannabis treatment for people who need it. And that was one of the most offensive things that the last government did, was it took away the right to say you were only using medicine, cannabis medicine, because you had to. They actually denied that as a defense. So everyone who's picked up with cannabis gets prosecuted. And I ask you, is this just? Is this a just way of dealing with a non-problem? And you might say, well, did it really do that? Well, they did. Here you are. Jackie Smith, 2004, no, I think it was probably Reid then, decided to up the penalties, up the attack on cannabis. And you see year on year a very significant increase in the number of convictions to 2007 and 8, 158,000 convictions for cannabis possession. And of course, it's not only is it illogical, it's also unjust, because there's also a disproportionate amount of criminalization of ethnic minorities, up to 3- to 4-fold in Asian and black communities, maybe 6 times more in black communities in London. So it's intrinsically unjust. And if I can slip back into medicine for a second, we have this concept in medicine, primum non nocere, first do no harm, one of Hippocrates' principles. And you do wonder whether maybe the same principles ought to apply to the law. Maybe the law shouldn't do harm before it. Certainly, that would be one way in which we could judge whether a harm was a good law, a law was a good law or not. And one of the reasons we have these crazy laws is because politicians do not understand why people take drugs. They think people take drugs the same way as they drink alcohol, that they enjoy it. But a lot of people take drugs to reduce suffering. And that criminalizing those people is particularly offensive. And here's some examples. A quarter of young male alcoholics, and that's going to include some of you in the audience, are very, very socially phobic. And they drink because it's the only way they can deal with the anxiety and therefore engage in conversations with people they want to converse with. It's the commonest treatable cause of alcoholism. About half of older drinkers use alcohol to reduce stress and assist relaxation and sleep. Unquestionably, a lot of you will do that. I will almost certainly do that later on, provided you're paying. But a lot of cannabis users do the same. I run a clinic, psychiatric clinic. A lot of my patients smoke cannabis because it helps them relax. The majority of schizophrenics use cannabis because it helps take away the unpleasantness of the disorder. And what we're doing now is we're saying to them, oh, your illness is your fault, because if you didn't smoke cannabis, you wouldn't be schizophrenic. And that's complete rubbish. They know that the cannabis makes their positive symptoms worse, the voices get worse. And they say, but I know that, but that doesn't concern me. What concerns me is all the other nastiness of the illness, and cannabis helps that. And so what we're blaming schizophrenics now for their own illness, which is one of the most cruel things we could ever do. A lot of people use stimulants because they've got ADHD, and we know that's a form of self-medication. So there are many reasons why people use drugs other than just to have fun, and politicians cannot understand that. Cannabis is something I feel particularly, well, you've probably gathered by now, particularly exercised by, because Queen Victoria thought it was the most wonderful medication. She said it was great, that's why she had so many children, because it took away the pain of childbirth and the pains afterwards, and it took away her gynecological problems. And it was a legal drug in this country till 1971. It was banned in 71 under the Misuse of Drugs Act because there were 2 GPs in London who were prescribing it because they wanted it for recreational use. They were telling people, drip it on cigarettes, dry off the alcohol, and then smoke it. And because 2 rogue GPs were doing that, we banned a useful medication. And it's been banned since then. And more than that, we do this. So here's an example of how that we have been approaching. The last government's attack on cannabis users has led to this. So an ex-teacher in her 50s, long-standing multiple sclerosis, in a wheelchair, uses cannabis, grows her own to provide release. Front door smashed down 3 times in the last few years. Dawn raids. They've broken into her house to find her with cannabis. So she's got convictions, because I say if you have possession, you're inevitably convicted, there's no defense. And is that what we want? Is that an appropriate measure of response to someone who's actually treating themselves with a medicine that used to be legal, which was arbitrarily banned? And I have to say, I find that this whole militaristic approach to dealing with drug problems is very disturbing. There are other justifications for illegality, of course. This one is the truth. This is why drugs are illegal. But it's very difficult to get the debate into the moral arena because politicians are much more comfortable hiding behind that smokescreen of health. And that's why they don't like me blowing away the smoke. And there's also public opinion. And public opinion is something that politicians claim to take a lot of account of. And when you say to them, well, surely, you don't take account of public opinion in terms of the death penalty, but why don't you show some moral courage around drugs? They sort of lurk away and say, well, can't do it all the time. But there's 2 kinds of public opinion. There's the real public opinion, which we sampled using a Murray poll when we did the 3rd cannabis report. And we asked people, what class should cannabis be? And a quarter of the population think cannabis should be legal, and 41% said it should not attract more than a 2-year prison sentence. So 2/3 of the population did not want cannabis reclassified. That's a Murray poll. That would predict who's going to get elected. So that tells you what the public think. Government took no notice. Because they prefer this kind of public opinion, which is the newspaper induce public opinion. Newspapers, they incite some kind of moral panic, and then they say, that's what the public think, because the public think what we tell them to think. And then the media challenge the government, and the government choose to believe, whether deliberately or covertly, the media's view. And so we get these harsher rules.